Dear listener, the evacuation message arrived without urgency. It repeated every 12 minutes, identical each time, as if certainty could be manufactured through consistency. Staff radios crackled with acknowledgments that never turned into action. People paused, looked around, and waited for someone else to move first. That hesitation mattered. Systems still existed, but coordination had already thinned, and the gap between instruction and behavior kept widening. I stayed seated longer than I should have, watching rows empty in uneven waves. Families left early, following the habit. Contractors lingered, expecting clarification. Security drifted toward exits, then vanished. The stadium did not clear, it hollowed. Spaces that once relied on density for order now amplified indecision. I understood then that evacuation was no longer a process, only a suggestion, and suggestions do not protect you. The logic to leave collapsed quietly. Outside meant roads, crowds, and unknown timing. Inside meant known distances, fixed barriers, and predictable sightlines. I wasn't choosing safety, only choosing which risks I could measure. The message kept repeating unchanged, while conditions were changing rapidly. That mismatch made the decision for me. I moved only after the final announcement looped and cut off mid-sentence. Power remained, but authority did not. Without staff presence, the building reverted to its physical reality: concrete, steel, and air. No one was directing flow anymore. I avoided main concourses, not out of fear, but because they attracted movement. Movement attracts attention. The first exterior noise confirmed what the broadcasts avoided numbing. It wasn't screaming or chaos. It was an irregular impact, out of rhythm with human urgency. I observed from elevation, counting seconds between sounds, noting direction changes. Whatever was outside did not move with purpose, but it moved persistently. That distinction mattered more than speed. Acceptance didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as a subtraction. Plans fell away until only what was immediately controllable remained. I stopped thinking about where I should be and focused on where I was. The stadium was emptying faster than it was being secured, and that imbalance would not correct itself. I gathered nothing unnecessary. Leaving the seat was the only irreversible action I took. Every step after that was deliberate. The evacuation had ended, not because it succeeded, but because no one was left to enforce it. Staying was not defiance. It was aligned with reality as it presented itself, incomplete, quiet, and already moving on. I used the remaining daylight to confirm boundaries and blind spots, walking service levels slowly, memorizing intersections and vertical access points. Elevation offered awareness but increased exposure, so I limited time near railings. Every choice reduces another option. By evening, the building felt less like a venue and more like terrain. When the lights dimmed automatically, I did not override them. Darkness outside was information. Darkness inside was concealment. I positioned myself where sound would travel poorly and waited, listening to the building settle. The evacuation message never returned. Night clarified priorities. I ate sparingly, avoided unnecessary movement, and marked time by temperature changes. Somewhere beyond the concrete shell, the city was reorganizing itself without consent. Inside, I focused on maintaining optionality. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by distant movement, and the knowledge that morning would demand new calculations. I understood then that survival here would depend on patience more than ingenuity. The stadium was empty, but it was not safe. It was simply known. Knowing a place does not remove danger, but it narrows it. That night marked the last time I waited for instructions. From that point forward, decisions would come from observation, not permission. The evacuation had been an experiment in order, and order had failed. What remained was responsibility, measured moment to moment, inside a structure built for thousands, now holding one. I did not feel brave. I felt precise. Precision was enough to carry me into the next day, and enough to accept that leaving later would be harder, not easier, the longer the world outside continued without coordination. That understanding settled in quietly, heavier than fear, shaping every movement that followed. There would be no rescue, only endurance built step by step. Inside the stadium, that was enough to begin. Alone, observant, and fully committed to staying alive. Thereafter only. Silence didn't arrive all at once. It drained out in layers. First the crowd noise disappeared, then the staff chatter, then the background hum of coordination that most people never consciously notice. The stadium still made sounds, air handlers cycling, distant doors swinging shut, but none of them meant anything anymore. They weren't signals. They were leftovers. I moved slowly through the concourse, not because I was afraid, but because speed assumed urgency, and urgency creates mistakes. Concession shutters were half lowered, abandoned mid-task. Trash bins overflowed where people dropped things without thinking. The place looked looted, but it was. It was simply unfinished, like everyone had expected to come back and clean up later. Scale became a problem immediately. The stadium was designed to manage tens of thousands of people moving in predictable ways. Without people, that scale turned hostile. Sightlines stretched too far. Sound traveled too freely. Corners multiplied. A small space limits threats. A massive one hides them. I tested doors without committing to opening them, feeling for resistance, listening for echoes. Many access points were unlocked, relying on staffing rather than barriers. That was normal before. It wasn't now. The building had been secure because it was occupied. Empty, it was porous. The quiet forced attention inward. Every footstep felt louder than it should have been. I adjusted my gait, shortening steps and rolling weight carefully. The concrete floors reflected sound upward toward open seating bowls that acted like acoustic dishes. Even a dropped object could advertise presence across levels. I avoided the field. Open space offers no control. Control comes from edges, not centers. Instead, I followed service corridors, the parts of the building meant to be unseen. These spaces were narrower, darker, and easier to read. Pipes, wiring, and scuffed walls told me who used them and how often. No fresh marks meant no recent movement. Time stretched. Without crowds, the stadium felt older, less purposeful. Its size no longer implied safety. It implied exposure. Any movement inside it would leave patterns. Paths worn, areas disturbed, routines visible from above. I began thinking in terms of signatures, what evidence I left behind simply by existing. The absence of authority became obvious when I reached security checkpoints. The screens were dark. The chairs were empty. Radio sat charging untouched. The systems hadn't failed mechanically. They had failed socially. No one was there to interpret or respond. That kind of failure doesn't trigger alarms. It just removes the response. I climbed one level and stopped listening. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of explanation. Distant noises carried without context. Metal shifting, wind through open gates, something moving where it shouldn't have been. Without reference points, everything demanded evaluation. I chose a temporary position where sound dampened naturally, tucked between concrete supports. From there, I watched the stadium age by the minute. Lights shut off in zones. Digital signs froze mid-message. The building wasn't dying. It was reverting to structure. That realization mattered. A structure doesn't care who uses it. It only reacts to physics, weight, vibration, airflow. Understanding that stripped away comfort but added clarity. The stadium wasn't sheltered by default. It was material to be negotiated. When full darkness settled, the silence changed again. Outside noise filtered in more clearly. Not louder, just more distinct. Whatever was happening beyond the walls was closer than before. The stadium no longer felt empty. It felt like a container. I stayed still until my breathing slowed and blended into the background systems. Movement would come later when purpose justified it. For now, learning the silence was the work. The stadium had stopped being a place for people. It was something else now, and until I understood what that was, any action would be premature. The quiet wasn't comforting. It was instructional. It showed me where I stood, how visible I might be, and how easily scale could turn against me. The noise was gone. What remained was space, and space demanded discipline. Rumors had a shape before they had substance. They traveled faster than evidence and filled gaps that observation hadn't reached yet. I'd heard fragments before the evacuation, disjointed warnings, partial explanations, but none of it mattered until there was something to measure. Survival doesn't begin with belief. It begins with confirmation. I positioned myself where I could see beyond the outer fence without being silhouetted. Elevation helped, but only if used briefly. Long exposure creates patterns. I watched in intervals, counting breaths, then pulling back. The city beyond the stadium was no longer moving with intent. Traffic lights still cycled, but vehicles sat abandoned mid-lane. Doors hung open where people had left in a hurry, or not at all. Movement appeared near the far service road first. Not fast, not purposeful. It crossed open ground without regard for cover or direction. That alone ruled out panic. Humans in danger cluster, accelerate, choose paths. This did none of that. It drifted, paused, then continued, drawn by nothing I could see. I waited. Confirmation requires patience. One data point is noise. Multiple points form a pattern. A second shape emerged, then a third, each separated by time rather than proximity. They did not react to one another. That mattered. No communication. No coordination. When a distant sound echoed, a loose gate swinging in the wind, they turned toward it slowly, not urgently, as if the sound registered but did not command. I adjusted my observation angle, careful not to touch railings. The infected, there was no reason to avoid the term anymore, moved with mechanical persistence. Joints worked but inefficiently. Momentum carried them more than intention. They did not scan their environment. They reacted to stimuli when it crossed a threshold, then returned to wandering. Distance kept emotion out of it. That was important. Fear compresses thinking. Observation expands it. I noted limits, turning radius, hesitation at obstacles, lack of vertical awareness. They passed beneath stairwells without looking up. That reduced one category of risk immediately. Sound mattered more than sight. When debris shifted, they converged slowly, then dispersed when nothing followed. There was no memory of their movement. No learning. That meant predictability, but also persistence. They would not give up. They would only move on. I watched until dusk erased detail. That was enough. I didn't need to see violence to understand the consequences. Whatever this was, it wasn't temporary. Emergency response requires mobility, coordination, and containment. None of those were visible. The evacuation hadn't failed at the edge. It had failed system-wide. Acceptance didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative. A set of assumptions expired all at once. Rescue timelines disappeared. External authority ceased to be relevant. The stadium was no longer adjacent to a functioning city. It was adjacent to unmanaged space. That distinction forced recalibration. Entry risk became inevitable, not hypothetical. The infected didn't need motivation to move toward the stadium. They would arrive eventually through noise, curiosity, or chance. The scale worked against me again. Large structures attract attention simply by existing. I pulled back into the interior, sealing nothing, changing nothing yet. Premature fortification creates false confidence and noise. Instead, I logged what I'd seen and adjusted internal priorities. Sound discipline moved to the top. Light control followed. Mobility routes were revised to avoid direct lines to exterior gates. The rumors had suggested chaos. What I saw was something worse, stability without control. A condition that would not burn itself out quickly or resolve cleanly. It would persist, unchanged until interrupted. That meant time was no longer a countdown. It was an environment. Every decision would exist inside it, not against it. I stopped thinking in terms of days and started thinking in terms of exposure cycles. How often movement would be required, how often mistakes could occur. When full darkness arrived, I didn't look out again. Confirmation was complete. Anything further would only add emotional weight, without increasing understanding. I had what I needed: limits, patterns, inevitability. Inside the stadium, I reorganized my position with that knowledge in mind. The threat was real, external, and ongoing. It didn't hate me. It didn't want anything. It would only respond. That was enough clarity to proceed. Speculation was over. Observation had done its job. From that point forward, every action would be shaped by what I had seen, not by what I hoped might still be untrue. Leaving was supposed to be the safe option. Every announcement, every sign, every painted arrow pointed outward, as if motion itself equaled survival. But movement only helps when it leads somewhere more stable. By the time I evaluated my options, stability outside the stadium was theoretical at best. Roads were uncontrolled, information was stale, and timing mattered more than intent. Staying was not comfortable. It was familiar. I knew the layout, the distances, the materials. I knew which areas carried sound and which absorbed it. I knew where elevation worked for awareness and where it turned into exposure. Outside, everything would reset to unknown variables. Inside, at least the risks were already mapped. Exiting meant committing to corridors I couldn't see beyond, funneled through choke points shared with anyone else still moving. It meant trusting that evacuation routes still led to safety, rather than congestion or containment failure. Trust had already proven unreliable. The longer I watched, the clearer it became that evacuation depended on cooperation that no longer existed. Fatigue factored in more than fear. Decision-making degrades under exhaustion, and movement demands constant recalculation. Staying reduces immediate cognitive load. I could slow down, observe, and preserve clarity. That mattered more than distance traveled. A mistake made inside a known environment was more survivable than one made blind. The stadium offered controlled access, even if not secure. Fences, gates, and elevation didn't stop threats, but they delayed them. Delay buys time. Time allows adjustment. Outside, there would be no delay, only reaction. Reaction favors whoever arrives prepared. I doubted anyone still was. I walked the primary exits once more, not to use them, but to understand them. Wide openings encouraged flow, but prevented concealment. Glass amplified light and sound. Emergency lighting created silhouettes. These exits were designed for crowds, not individuals. Alone, they were liabilities. Staying also meant conserving information. If I left, I lost the chance to watch patterns form around a fixed point. Remaining allowed me to see how the environment changed over time, how sound traveled at night, how movement outside responded to the building itself. The stadium was a reference frame. Without it, everything blurred. Emotion tried to intrude. The instinct to follow instructions runs deep. So does the fear of being left behind. I acknowledged both, then set them aside. Survival decisions aren't democratic. They don't require consensus or permission. They require alignment with conditions as they are, not as they're described. I chose a zone that balanced distance from the exterior with access to vertical movement, not too deep, not too exposed. From there, I could relocate if needed without crossing high-traffic areas. Staying put didn't mean staying still. It meant limiting unnecessary displacement. I avoided making the decision feel permanent. Permanence creates rigidity. Instead, I treated it as a pause with intention, a deliberate hold to gather data, rest, and recalibrate. The option to leave later remained open, but only if conditions justified it. For now, they didn't. Night settled fully, and with it came confirmation. Sounds outside increased, not in volume but in frequency. Movement was becoming more common. Leaving that would have meant timing my exit against variables I couldn't influence. Staying allowed me to wait until patterns stabilized, or at least revealed themselves. I secured nothing beyond my immediate area. Overfortification advertises presence and creates dependence. Mobility remained my primary defense. Staying was not about building a base yet. It was about buying clarity without spending energy. By the end of that night, the decision no longer felt like a choice. It felt like alignment. I wasn't hiding from the world outside. I was acknowledging that, for now, it offered no advantage. The stadium wasn't safe, but it was known. It was enough to proceed. Morning would demand reassessment. It always would. Staying was not a commitment to isolation forever. It was a refusal to rush into uncertainty without leverage. In a situation defined by collapse, restraint became the first form of control. The stadium could not be treated as a single shelter. Thinking that way would have been comforting, but comfort had already proven unreliable. Its size worked against the idea of control. Too many entrances, too much vertical space, too many surfaces that carried sound. Survival required narrowing focus, not claiming territory. I began by breaking the building into zones based on function rather than location. Public spaces were liabilities. Seating bowls, concourses, and atriums were designed to move people efficiently, which meant they also moved sound and attention. Service areas were different. They were meant to be quiet, ignored, and utilitarian. Those traits made them valuable. Access points mattered more than walls. A locked door was temporary. An unseen approach path was lasting. I traced how someone unfamiliar would move through the stadium, following signage, lighting, and obvious routes. Those paths became areas to avoid. Predictability attracts both infected people and people. Elevation was a double-edged tool. Higher levels offered visibility, but also isolation if movement was cut off. Ladders and stairwells became choke points. I noted which ones allowed lateral movement and which trapped anyone who committed to them. Vertical escape without horizontal options was not escape at all. Sound behavior defined safe zones. I tested surfaces carefully, tapping lightly, listening to how noise traveled. Metal railings carried vibration farther than expected. Open seating acted like an amplifier. Low ceilings and irregular walls absorbed sound. These observations mattered more than square footage. Lighting followed similar rules. Emergency systems created pools of visibility that shifted over time. Staying inside those pools would outline movement against darkness. I preferred shadowed transition spaces where light spilled unevenly. Darkness wasn't concealment by itself. It had to be paired with stillness. Utilities added another layer. Water access, drainage, and temperature stability varied across the building. Areas near mechanical systems stayed warmer at night, but carried operational noise. Completely silent zones were colder and darker, but less discoverable. I favored places that balanced both, even if they were uncomfortable. I avoided the temptation to secure a large area. Defending space requires constant presence. I didn't have that capacity. Instead, I selected a compact primary zone with multiple exit options and several secondary fallback positions. No single failure would trap me completely. Movement routes were memorized forward and backward. Under stress, direction reverses easily. Dead ends kill more people than threats. I cleared nothing permanently. Clearing implies ownership. I wanted ambiguity. If something entered the stadium, it should not immediately know where I was, or if I was there at all. The stadium was not a fortress. It was a filter. It was delayed, redirected, and confused. That was its value. Treating it as shelter meant accepting exposure while managing it carefully. Walls alone do not provide safety. Behavior does. By the end of the assessment, I understood that survival here would depend on remaining small inside something massive. I didn't need to control the stadium. I only needed to exist within it without leaving a clear outline. The building would not protect me, but if I respected its limitations, it might give me time. That understanding changed how I behaved inside it. I stopped thinking in terms of rooms and started thinking in terms of margins. How much noise could I afford? How quickly I could disappear from a space? Which paths remained usable after fatigue set in? The stadium rewarded caution but punished routine. Any pattern repeated too often became visible, even without an observer. I rotated locations, varied timing, and left areas intentionally untouched so they looked abandoned. Survival here would not come from making the place mine. It would come from never fully revealing that anyone was present at all. That restraint demanded constant awareness. Comfort invited mistakes. Rest had to be earned in fragments, never taken for granted. Even sleep became a calculated risk, shaped by sound, temperature, and escape options. The stadium offered time, not forgiveness. Any lapse would echo far beyond its cause, drawing consequences long after the error itself. I treated every hour as provisional, knowing conditions could shift without warning, and that adaptability, not confidence, would decide how long I remained alive here, inside the stadium's exposed structure alone. The stadium looked abundant at first glance. Concessions stood stocked behind metal shutters. Storage rooms held cases of sealed drinks and packaged food. That illusion was dangerous. Abundance only matters if it can be accessed repeatedly without increasing exposure. What I needed wasn't supplied. It was a system. Water came first. Everything else was secondary. Without reliable water, calories were meaningless. I located the main utility rooms and traced plumbing routes where I could, listening for pressure changes when taps were opened briefly. Municipal supply still flowed intermittently, but relying on it blindly would have been a mistake. Pressure fails without warning. I filled containers whenever it was available, but never assumed it would return. I avoided gathering water from public restrooms during daylight hours. Those spaces echoed and sat along predictable routes. Instead, I identified maintenance sinks and service connections tucked away from foot traffic. They were harder to reach but quieter. Distance was a trade-off I accepted. Carrying water farther once was safer than returning often. Food required a different calculation. Concessions offered calories, but also visibility. Bright packaging, open layouts, and debris trails created signatures. I limited intake to what could be moved discreetly and stored near my primary zone. Excess food left where it became bait, not security. I resisted the urge to consolidate everything. Centralized stockpiles feel efficient, but they create single points of failure. I cached supplies in small quantities across multiple fallback positions. Losing one would hurt, but not end everything. Redundancy mattered more than convenience. Movement between caches was staggered and irregular. Patterns invite attention. Even without observers, routine creates complacency. I varied timing and routes, sometimes skipping retrieval even when it would have been easier. Hunger was preferable to predictability. Waste management mattered more than I expected. Trash accumulates quietly, then announces itself through smell and noise. I controlled waste aggressively, compressing packaging and relocating refuse away from living areas. Organic waste was sealed and isolated. Anything that attracted attention had to be managed or removed. Calories were rationed not by scarcity, but by workload. I matched intake to exertion, avoiding both starvation and excess. Overeating dull awareness. Undereating clouds judgment. Consistency mattered. I tracked consumption mentally, not obsessively, but enough to notice drift. Lighting affected logistics too. Gathering supplies in low light reduced visibility, but increased error. I compromised by working in brief, controlled illumination, shielding light sources and never letting them remain static. Light that moves suggests presence. Light that flickers suggests activity. I avoided both. Temperature played its role. Cold increased caloric demand. Heat increased water loss. I adjusted positioning accordingly, sleeping where temperatures were stable, working where discomfort was tolerable but temporary. Comfort zones were reserved for recovery, not labor. I also accounted for time. Every trip carried risk. I grouped tasks to minimize movement, even if it meant waiting. Waiting costs nothing. Moving always costs something, even if the cost isn't obvious immediately. As days passed, the system settled. Not because conditions improved, but because variables became bounded. I knew where water could still be found. I knew how much food I could consume without triggering risky behavior. I knew how long tasks took and how fatigue accumulated. The stadium stopped feeling abundant and started feeling finite. That shift was healthy. Scarcity sharpens discipline. False abundance breeds waste. I treated every resource as replaceable only once. After that, it was gone. By managing logistics quietly and conservatively, I reduced the need for improvisation. Improvisation is loud. Planning is silent. Inside a structure this large, silence was survival. The stadium did not provide for me. It allowed me to extract what remained slowly, carefully, without announcing that anyone was doing so. That balance between use and concealment defined whether staying here was viable long-term or merely delaying the inevitable. So far, the math worked. Water flowed enough. Calories held steady. Movement remained controlled. That was success, measured not by comfort, but by the absence of problems. In an environment like this, nothing going wrong was the best possible outcome. The stadium was never meant to be quiet. Every surface, every curve, every open span was designed to carry sound outward and upward. Crowd noise was supposed to build, echo, and amplify. Without people, that design turned against me. Silence wasn't passive here. It had to be manufactured. I learned quickly that stillness mattered more than volume. A soft noise in the wrong place traveled farther than a louder one absorbed by structure. I tested this carefully, snapping fingers once, then waiting. Some sounds dissolved immediately. Others came back altered, delayed, multiplied. Those areas were marked mentally as hostile. Movement became segmented. I stopped walking continuously and started moving in short bursts, pausing between steps. Pauses broke sound patterns. Continuous motion created a trail. Even breathing needed adjustment. Exertion came in measured intervals to avoid heavy respiration, which carried farther than expected in enclosed bowls and corridors. Footwear mattered. Rubber soles gripped but squeaked under certain conditions. Hard soles transmitted vibration. I modified how my feet landed, rolling weight from edge to center, avoiding heel strikes. It slowed me down, but speed was no longer an asset. Precision was. I stopped carrying loose items entirely. Anything that could clink, shift, or rub was either secured tightly or abandoned. I learned to pack by inversion, turning containers upside down before moving to listen for internal movement. If it made noise when still, it would be worse in motion. Time of movement mattered as much as method. External noise masked internal mistakes. Wind, distant impacts, even weather created brief windows where sound blended into the background. I waited for those moments before repositioning. Waiting cost nothing. Moving at the wrong time could cost everything. The stadium's acoustics punished repetition. Using the same route repeatedly created familiarity, not just for me, but potentially for anything responding to patterns. I rotated paths even when inefficient, accepting extra distance to reduce predictability. Predictable silence was as dangerous as predictable noise. Vertical movement was handled with restraint. Stairwells acted like chimneys, carrying sound upward. I descended slowly, pausing between flights, listening before continuing. I avoided ladders unless necessary. Metal transmitted vibration too efficiently. Even controlled movement left signatures. Work tasks were split across days. Any action that required effort, relocating supplies, adjusting shelter zones, testing access points, was limited to short sessions. Fatigue caused sloppy movement. Sloppy movement created noise. I preferred underachievement to correction. I also learned to listen differently. The silence inside the stadium wasn't empty. It was layered. Mechanical hums, thermal expansion, distant exterior movement all blended into a baseline. Any deviation from that baseline mattered. The building told me when something changed, if I paid attention. Sleeping required compromise. Total silence increased sensitivity, making every minor sound jarring. I chose areas with consistent ambient noise, just enough to mask small disturbances without advertising my location. Consistency mattered more than quiet. I avoided reacting immediately to unexplained sounds. Reaction creates movement. Movement creates exposure. I waited, counted, assessed direction and repetition. Most noises resolved themselves. The few that didn't provided information without demanding a response. The hardest adjustment was mental. Humans associate silence with safety. Here, silence was neutral. It did not protect me. Discipline did. Silence only mattered if paired with behavior that respected it. One careless action could undo hours of restraint. Over time, the effort became automatic. I stopped thinking about being quiet and started thinking about not disturbing the environment. There's a difference. Quiet focuses inward. Non-disturbance focuses outward. The stadium reacted to both. Living quietly didn't mean hiding in place. It meant existing without an imprint. No repeated paths. No consistent timing. No obvious resource depletion. I wanted the building to look as abandoned tomorrow as it did today. The stadium remained loud in its own way. Wind through open gates, distant impacts outside, the occasional echo of something moving where it shouldn't. My job was not to eliminate sound, but to ensure none of it could be traced back to intention. That discipline reduced risk more than any barrier could have. Inside a structure built to amplify crowds, anonymity came not from silence alone, but from behaving as if I were never there at all. Tools felt reassuring at first. The stadium contained everything from maintenance equipment to emergency supplies, and the temptation was to collect options. Options create confidence. Too much confidence creates movement, and movement carries cost. I had to reverse the instinct to gather, and instead decide what I could afford to carry, use, and abandon without regret. Every tool earned its place by reducing risk, not expanding capability. Anything that encouraged me to do more, move farther, or stay longer in exposed areas worked against me. I avoided multi-purpose tools that promised versatility but required setup, noise, or concentration. Complexity was fragile. Simplicity survived mistakes. Weight mattered even indoors. Fatigue accumulates quietly, then shows up as missteps and dropped objects. I tested loads by moving short distances, stopping, listening to my breathing, feeling how balance shifted. If carrying something changed how I moved, it wasn't worth it. Mobility was my primary defense, and anything that compromised it was a liability. Space dictated tool choice. Long implements were awkward in narrow corridors. Tools that required swinging or leverage risked contact with walls, railings, or fixtures. Even minor impacts echoed unpredictably. I favored compact tools that worked close to the body and could be controlled with minimal motion. Noise potential eliminated most candidates immediately. Anything with moving parts, metal-on-metal contact, or loose components was either modified or discarded. I wrapped handles, padded contact points, and removed unnecessary attachments. If a tool couldn't be silenced reliably, it wasn't coming with me. Repairability mattered more than durability. Nothing lasts forever, especially under improvised use. I chose tools I could maintain with what was already available inside the stadium. Specialized equipment failed once it broke. Simple tools degraded gradually, giving warning before becoming useless. I intentionally limited duplication. Redundancy feels safe, but carrying backups increases load and encourages riskier behavior. Instead, I placed secondary tools in fallback zones. That way, redundancy existed without following me everywhere. Losing one position wouldn't mean losing all capability. Lighting tools required special consideration. Light solved problems but created others. I selected low-output options that could be shielded and used briefly. Bright, fixed light sources stayed where they were. Portable light was for transitions only, never tasks. I worked by touch whenever possible, accepting slower progress to avoid visibility. Containers were as important as tools. How something was carried mattered more than what it did. Rigid containers prevented shifting, but added weight. Soft containers absorbed sound, but wore out. I mixed both, prioritizing quiet over longevity. A worn bag that didn't announce itself was preferable to a pristine one that did. I avoided improvising new tools unless necessary. Improvisation created debris, noise, and distraction. The stadium already contained what it had, forcing it to provide more increased exposure. Restraint preserved options for later, when conditions might demand them. Space also affected where tools lived. I didn't keep everything with me. Tools followed tasks, not the other way around. When a task ended, the tools stayed behind, staged where they would next be needed. Carrying tools just in case was a habit from a safer world. I tracked how often each item was used. Anything untouched for several days became suspect. Either it wasn't needed, or it encouraged unnecessary planning. Planning that never turns into action still consumes attention. Attention was a finite resource. The hardest tools to abandon were the ones that felt empowering. Anything that made me imagine confrontation, control, or dominance had to be questioned. Those fantasies had no place here. Survival favored withdrawal, not engagement. Over time, my kit grew smaller, not larger. That reduction wasn't a loss. It was refined. Each item left served a clear purpose under tight constraints. If it couldn't justify its weight, noise, and space, it didn't belong. Inside the stadium, the environment already imposed limits. Respecting those limits through tool selection kept me aligned with reality. Carrying less meant thinking more, moving cleaner and recovering faster. In a place where mistakes echoed, lightness became a form of discipline. By accepting fewer tools, I gained something more valuable, freedom of movement without hesitation. And in an environment built to magnify errors, that freedom mattered more than any object I could carry. Injury was the threat that never announced itself. It didn't move outside the fences or respond to sound. It waited quietly inside routine, fatigue, and small decisions made too quickly. Inside the stadium, there would be no backup, no rescue, no margin for recovery mistakes. A twisted ankle could be fatal weeks later. A cut could end things slowly without drama. I adjusted my behavior around that reality immediately. Strength stopped being useful the moment it encouraged risk. I avoided lifting anything that required strain, even if I could manage it in the moment. Strain accumulates invisibly. Muscles fail first, joints follow, and balance goes last. By the time balance goes, it's already too late. Climbing was treated as an emergency action, not a convenience. Ladders, scaffolding, and maintenance platforms existed everywhere, but height multiplied consequences. I tested every rung before committing weight. If a route required reaching or overextending, I abandoned it. Efficiency was irrelevant. Stability mattered. Footing became a constant calculation. Dust spilled liquids, and loose debris turned smooth surfaces into traps. I cleared only what was necessary for safe passage and left everything else untouched. Overcleaning created noise and false confidence. Familiar hazards were easier to remember than newly exposed ones. I limited how long I worked without rest, even when energy felt available. Fatigue doesn't announce itself honestly. It lies, suggesting one more task is harmless. I broke work into blocks and stopped before exhaustion, not after. Rest wasn't recovery. It was prevention. Sleep was handled carefully. I avoided positions that restricted movement or required awkward exits. If I had to wake suddenly, I needed to be able to stand without strain. I kept pathways clear enough to move in low light without rushing. Rushing was how injuries happened. Hands deserved as much protection as feet. Small cuts become infections when cleanliness is inconsistent. I avoided bare-handed work whenever possible and cleaned even minor abrasions immediately. Time spent on prevention paid off later when resources were thinner. Temperature affected risk more than I expected. Cold stiffened joints and slowed reaction time. Heat increased dehydration and dizziness. I adjusted activity to avoid extremes, even if it meant doing less overall. Doing less was acceptable. Doing something wrong was not. I paid attention to warning signs: muscle tremors, joint tightness, shallow breathing. None of these stopped me outright, but they changed priorities. Ignoring early signals led to cascading failure. Responding early meant delaying tasks, not abandoning survival. I also limited improvisation under fatigue. Complex tasks were reserved for periods of clarity. When tired, I focused on maintenance and observation instead. Fatigue turns creativity into recklessness. The stadium rewarded repetition, not innovation. I avoided running entirely. Speed trades control for time, and time wasn't my limiting factor. Distance inside the stadium could be covered slowly without consequence. Running introduced uneven breathing, noise, and imbalance. There was no scenario where it helped more than it hurt. Load management mattered again here. Carrying weight changed posture, posture changed balance, and balance determined injury risk. I reduced loads even further, making more trips only when conditions were ideal. More trips cost time. Injury cost survival. I planned exits not just for threats, but for physical failure. If I fell here, where would I land? If my leg failed there, could I crawl somewhere defensible? Thinking this way wasn't pessimism. It was contingency planning. Isolation magnified consequences. In a group, injuries are shared. Alone, they compound. That knowledge forced humility. I stopped testing limits entirely. The goal wasn't to see what I could survive. It was to avoid finding out. As days passed, caution became a habit. Movement smoothed out. I stopped reaching, stopped jumping, stopped hurrying. The stadium didn't punish slowness. It punished errors. I adapted to that truth. Survival here wasn't about avoiding the infected alone. It was about avoiding the quiet, preventable mistakes that no one would ever witness. Injury didn't need drama to end things. It only needed one careless moment. By respecting my physical limits relentlessly, I removed the most unpredictable variable from the equation. I couldn't control what entered the stadium. I could control how I moved inside it. That discipline didn't make me safer in a dramatic way. It made me last. And in a place defined by isolation and scale, lasting was the only measure that mattered. I didn't map the stadium to understand it. I mapped it to reduce hesitation. Hesitation is where mistakes form. In a structure this large, uncertainty multiplied faster than threats. Knowing where I was mattered less than knowing where I could go next without thinking. I started with repetition, walking the same short routes at different times, from different directions under different light conditions. The building changed depending on when and how it was used. Shadows shifted. Sounds behaved differently. What felt safe at midday became exposed at night. Mapping had to account for that variability. I ignored public maps entirely. They showed idealized movement, not reality. I built my own reference points instead. Turns that scraped my shoulder, a patch of warmer air near a vent, the sound difference between concrete seams. These were anchors that didn't depend on visibility. Service corridors became the backbone of the map. They connected everything without advertising it. Unlike concourses, they didn't funnel movement. They branched unpredictably, which made them harder to navigate but easier to disappear inside. I learned which ones dead-ended and which looped back into the system. Dead ends were memorized carefully. They were acceptable only if they offered concealment or vertical escape. Vertical movement required its own mapping. Stairwells varied in width, lighting, and sound behavior. Some carried echoes upward like chimneys. Others absorbed sound and heat. I noted which ones connected to multiple levels and which terminated abruptly. Elevation changes were dangerous when unfamiliar. I reduced that danger through familiarity. Maintenance rooms were logged not for supplies, but for space. Empty rooms offered temporary shelter during movement. Cluttered ones offered concealment but limited exits. I preferred emptiness. An empty room could be exited quickly. A cluttered one could trap you. I never mapped in a straight line. Linear exploration created predictable paths. Instead, I approached areas obliquely, entering from different angles on different days. That way, no single route defined access. If something followed one path, I would still have alternatives. I also mapped the sound. Certain corridors amplified footsteps. Others swallowed them. I tested by creating controlled noise and retreating to listen. That information mattered more than distance. A shorter route that echoed was worse than a longer one that absorbed movement. Lighting patterns were recorded mentally. Emergency lights failed in sequences, not all at once. Some areas stayed lit long after others went dark. I avoided relying on those zones. When the lights eventually failed, unfamiliar darkness would create panic. I wanted darkness to be expected. I marked danger zones as carefully as safe ones. Loose flooring, low ceilings, exposed wiring. These hazards didn't move, but fatigue made them lethal. Knowing where they were allowed me to navigate without constantly scanning the ground. Mapping wasn't done quickly. Rushing created blind spots. I accepted that full familiarity would take days, maybe weeks. The point wasn't completeness. It was confidence. Confidence reduced cognitive load, which reduced error. I avoided leaving physical markers. Tape, chalk, debris piles all announced intentional movement. Instead, I used memory reinforced through repetition. If a route couldn't be remembered naturally, it wasn't reliable under stress. The map lived in layers: immediate movement routes, secondary escape paths, emergency retreats. Each layer overlapped but didn't depend on the others. Losing one option didn't collapse the whole system. As the interior became familiar, the stadium shrank psychologically. It stopped feeling like an overwhelming mass and started feeling like connected volumes. That shift mattered. Large unknown spaces encourage fear. Known spaces encourage planning. I also mapped from imagined perspectives. If something entered here, where would it go? Which routes looked obvious? Which areas invited exploration? That helped me stay out of those spaces. Safety came from being where nothing had a reason to look. Mapping changed how I moved. I stopped wandering. Every step had context. Even pauses had purpose. When something unexpected happened, I didn't freeze. I shifted to the next known option automatically. The stadium remained massive, but it was no longer abstract. It had shape, limits, and behavior. Understanding that didn't make it safe. It made it navigable. In an environment where improvisation was punished, preparation became movement without thought. Mapping wasn't about control. It was about removing uncertainty before uncertainty removed me. Once the interior was mapped well enough, I could operate quietly, efficiently, and without second-guessing. That alone reduced risk more than any barricade ever could. The building still held danger, but it no longer held surprises. And in a place like this, surprises were what killed you. The first sign wasn't movement. It was absent. A stretch of ground outside the stadium that had been consistently empty began to show disturbance. Scuffed dirt, shifted debris. A door no longer hanging the way it had been the day before. Nothing dramatic. Just evidence that someone else was making decisions in the same environment. I didn't approach the fence right away. Curiosity creates exposure. Instead, I adjusted my observation schedule, widening the window and narrowing my presence. I watched from multiple interior angles, never twice from the same position. If I could see out, it meant someone outside could potentially see in. The people appeared gradually. Not in groups, not with purpose, but cautiously, as if testing the edges of the world. They moved differently than the infected. They paused with intention. They scanned, hesitated, changed direction for reasons I couldn't hear. That difference mattered. Humans bring variables the dead don't. I counted them over hours, not minutes. 1 became 2. 2 became 4, never all at once. They avoided open ground, using vehicles and barriers as cover. That suggested experience or fear, possibly both. Either way, it meant they were adaptable. I resisted the urge to signal. Contact isn't neutral. Once made, it can't be undone. Even a small acknowledgement shifts dynamics. I had no way of knowing what resources they lacked, what risks they carried, or how desperation might influence their choices. Distance preserved options. The stadium itself became part of the equation. Large structures attract attention, not because they promise safety, but because they promise answers. Shelter, supplies, elevation. Anyone still moving would eventually notice it. I had assumed anonymity through scale. That assumption was now questionable. I studied how they interacted with the perimeter. Gates were tested lightly, not forced. Fences were examined, not climbed. That restraint told me something. They were assessing, not invading. For now, sound discipline became critical. Even small mistakes inside could travel outward. I adjusted routines immediately, reducing movement during daylight when visibility favored observers. Nights were quieter but carried farther. Timing became a balancing act. I also began thinking in terms of perception. From the outside, what did the stadium look like? Dark, empty, silent. That was good. Any deviation from that baseline would raise questions. Smoke, light, repeated movement. Each was a signal I couldn't afford to send. The presence of others introduced a new risk category: interpretation. The infected reacted to stimuli. People interpreted it. A single misread action could turn caution into aggression. I had to assume that if I was seen, I would be assessed as either threat or resource. Neither outcome favored me. I shifted fallback positions deeper into the interior, not out of fear, but to lengthen response time. If someone breached the perimeter, delay would matter. Delay allowed listening, not reacting. Reacting too early exposed intent. Reacting too late removed options. I also watched how long they stayed. Lingering suggested interest. Brief passes suggested scouting. Their behavior shifted over days. They returned at similar times, though not precisely. That hinted at routine, which meant they were settling somewhere nearby. Routine creates friction. Eventually, I need to force decisions: water, food, shelter. The stadium could satisfy all three temporarily. That made it a magnet, whether I wanted it to be or not. I accepted then that isolation was no longer absolute. Even without contact, my environment now included other decision-makers. That required adjustment, not panic. Panic assumes immediacy. This was gradual. I reviewed escape routes with fresh eyes. Which paths avoided exterior walls? Which exits opened into blind, terrain rather than open ground? Leaving remained an option, but only under controlled conditions. Being forced out would be catastrophic. I did not arm myself more heavily. That would have been emotional preparation, not tactical. Violence introduces noise, injury, and consequence. Avoidance remained superior. My goal was not to defend territory, but to remain irrelevant. At night, I listened for changes: voices, metal impacts, attempts to access lower gates. Nothing yet, but absence again became information. They hadn't left. They hadn't pushed in. They were deciding. So was I. Contact beyond the fence didn't mean immediate danger. It meant the margin was shrinking. The stadium was no longer just terrain. It was an object of interest. From that point on, every action had to assume an audience, even if unseen. Survival had shifted again, not from infection to people, but from environment to perception. Staying alive now meant managing how others understood the space I occupied, without ever letting them understand that I was part of it. That balance between presence and invisibility would decide how long the stadium remained viable, and whether the next contact stayed beyond the fence or crossed it. Patterns emerged before danger did. The stadium itself hadn't changed, but my interaction with it had, and repetition was beginning to show. I noticed it first in my own behavior, moving at the same hours, using the same access points, relying on the same shadows. Efficiency was creating predictability, and predictability was a signal. Being found didn't require entry. It only required notice. Light escaping through a service door, a shadow crossing a familiar opening, the faint echo of work done too often in one place. Even absence could be read. Supplies disappearing from one area, and not another told a story to anyone observant enough to look. I shifted priorities immediately. Survival was no longer just about hiding. It was about managing how my presence could be inferred. I reduced visible change wherever possible, leaving spaces partially disturbed rather than fully cleared. Completion draws attention. Incompleteness suggests abandonment. Light became my primary liability. Even brief illumination could be traced by someone patient. I shortened light use further, relying on touch and memory. When light was necessary, I changed locations afterward, never using the same place twice in a row. Light without movement is a marker. Movement without light is forgettable. Smoke was eliminated entirely. Heat sources were limited to times when exterior conditions masked them. Warm air rises, carry scent, and leave signatures on cold surfaces. I adjusted sleeping areas to avoid creating consistent thermal patterns near exterior walls. Noise discipline evolved again. It wasn't enough to be quiet. I had to be inconsistently quiet. Absolute silence followed by brief noise stands out. I introduced controlled background disturbance by choosing locations where environmental sound already existed. Blending mattered more than mooting. Routine had to be dismantled carefully. Sudden change is as visible as repetition. I staggered adjustments over days, altering timing by small margins. 10 minutes later, one level higher, a different route but the same destination. The goal was to smear my signature, not erase it. I also began thinking like an outsider. If I were approaching this structure, where would I look first? Which doors felt promising? Which levels suggested access? Those places became off-limits to me. I retreated from the obvious advantage and chose inconvenience instead. Caching behavior changed. Previously reliable locations were rotated out, not emptied. Empty spaces signal use. Partially stocked ones suggest neglect. I moved supplies in small amounts, never enough to create visible depletion. Loss of efficiency was acceptable. Loss of ambiguity was not. I prepared for the possibility that discovery wouldn't be immediate or hostile. Someone might notice signs and observe quietly, the same way I had. That meant discovery could lag days behind cause. Response had to be preemptive, not reactive. Fallback positions were adjusted with concealment in mind. I favored areas that looked structurally unimportant, even uncomfortable. People gravitate toward features that promise utility. I hid among things that looked useless. The hardest adjustment was psychological. There's comfort in routine, even dangerous routine. Breaking it felt like losing control. In reality, control was returning. Uncertainty applied outward is safer than uncertainty applied inward. I avoided watching the perimeter constantly. Fixation narrows behavior. Instead, I trusted the systems I'd built and checked in deliberately, at varied intervals. Anxiety creates noise, if not in sound, then in movement. The stadium was no longer empty in the way it had been. It was occupied by possibility. Being found wasn't a moment. It was a process that began long before contact. My task was to slow that process until conditions changed or options expanded. If discovery came anyway, I wanted it to arrive late, incomplete, and uncertain. Confusion favors the unseen. Certainty favors the aggressor. Every choice now aimed to preserve confusion as long as possible. By managing visibility rather than chasing invisibility, I extended the stadium, usefulness. It remained viable not because it hid me perfectly, but because it told no clear story to anyone watching. That ambiguity was fragile. It demanded constant adjustment and restraint. But it worked. For now, the stadium still looked abandoned. And as long as it did, I could continue shaping my survival around absence rather than confrontation. That bought time, options, and space to think clearly longer. The first breach didn't come with force. It came with curiosity. A gate that had been tested too many times finally gave way, not because it was weak, but because patience wore it down. I didn't see it happen. I heard the change afterward, a difference in how sound moved through the lower service corridors, a new echo where there hadn't been one before. People entering a space behaved differently than people passing through it. They slow down. They touch things. They leave hesitation behind them like a wake. I stayed still and listened, mapping movement by absence as much as presence. Footsteps stopped where they shouldn't have. Voices dropped, then rose again. That told me they were orienting themselves, not fleeing. This wasn't a raid. It was an exploration. That distinction mattered. Explorers assume time. They assume they can afford mistakes. That assumption creates opportunity, but only if you don't rush to exploit it. I relocated immediately, not far, just enough to break any accidental line of movement. Distance didn't matter as much as angle. If they advanced along expected routes, I needed to exist somewhere unintuitive. I chose a space that offered poor visibility but multiple exits, prioritizing escape over concealment. Concealment fails once discovered. Escape fails only if poorly planned. I avoided looking for them directly. Visual confirmation tempts reaction. Reaction narrows thinking. Instead, I tracked sound patterns, weight shifts, object handling, the subtle rhythm of people who believe they're alone. They moved confidently at first, then more cautiously. That transition marked the moment they realized the stadium wasn't as empty as it appeared. I resisted the urge to prepare for confrontation. Tools stayed where they were. Positions remained flexible. Violence would have solved nothing. Even if successful, it would have announced my presence to anyone else listening. The stadium would remember that noise long after the moment passed. Timing became my ally. People need to pause, confer, decide. In those pauses, movement elsewhere goes unnoticed. I used those gaps to reposition incrementally, never more than necessary. Each move reduced overlap between their exploration and my existence. I also accounted for human unpredictability. Unlike the infected, people change behavior when challenged. Fear makes them loud. Confidence makes them careless. Either could turn this situation volatile. I needed to remain irrelevant long enough for them to lose interest or redirect. The stadium's scale worked again, but only because I respected it. I didn't try to control entry points or shadow movement directly. Control requires presence. Presence creates risk. Instead, I let the building do what it was designed to do: confuse, separate, delay. I listened for intent. Were they searching for shelter, supplies, or people? The difference mattered. Shelter seekers settle. Supply seekers strip and leave. People seekers escalate. Their conversations suggested assessment, not pursuit. That was encouraging, but not comforting. I adjusted fallback routes again, assuming worst-case outcomes. If they spread, which areas would become unsafe first? If they stayed overnight, which zones would attract activity? I prepared to abandon primary positions without attachment. Attachment creates hesitation. Hesitation kills options. At no point did I announce myself. Silence was not avoidance. It was a strategy. Revealing presence invites negotiation or conflict, neither of which favored me. Negotiation assumes shared goals. Conflict assumes acceptable loss. I had neither. Hours passed. Movement slowed. Eventually, they consolidated somewhere deeper in the structure, likely choosing comfort over control. That choice was predictable. Comfort feels safe. It is. I stayed awake long after their activity settled, not out of fear but necessity. The aftermath of entry is often more dangerous than entry itself. Guards relax. Attention wanders. Mistakes happen. I needed to know if their behavior shifted again. By morning, it was clear they had not discovered me, but they had discovered the stadium. That changed everything. The space was no longer ambiguous. It was now occupied territory, even if loosely. I accepted then that disengagement would eventually be required, not immediately, not recklessly, but deliberately. The stadium could no longer support indefinite invisibility. Human presence compresses margins faster than the infected ever could. Still, the night proved something important. I didn't need to dominate the space to survive within it. I needed to remain unimportant. While they pushed in, I moved around them, not away. That discipline, choosing withdrawal over assertion, kept me alive without leaving a trace. For now, that was enough. But it was also a warning. The stadium had entered its final phase. Not collapse, but contention. And contention never resolves quietly. I stopped thinking of the stadium as temporary and began treating it as an environment. That shift changed every decision. Temporary shelters tolerate shortcuts. Environments punish them. Survival now meant maintenance, not escape, repetition instead of urgency. I accepted permanence without assuming safety. That distinction kept me precise. Long-term thinking. Days settled into cycles shaped by light, temperature, and sound. I refined routines to survive boredom without creating patterns. Predictability attracts attention, even from nothing. I rotated tasks, altered timing, and resisted efficiency when efficiency became visible. Stability required motion without repetition. That balance defined sustainability, not comfort, just function. The stadium stopped feeling empty and started feeling neutral. Neutral spaces reveal behavior. I paid attention to how the building responded to use over time. Doors loosened, surfaces marked, air shifted. I adjusted before changes accumulated. Small corrections prevented large consequences. Maintenance became survival. Neglect became exposure. I chose maintenance. Living here long-term required accepting that nothing would resolve. No rescue timeline, no final clearing, no return to normal. Accepting that removed impatience. Impatience causes risk. I stopped waiting for change and focused on managing conditions. Conditions could be shaped, not solved. That mindset reduced error. It made time usable. I documented everything worth remembering: routes, caches, timings, mistakes. Memory degrades under stress. Written systems persist. Documentation wasn't nostalgia, it was insurance. If I was injured, tired, or distracted, the systems would outlast me. Survival here depended on continuity. I planned for my own failure. That reduced fear. Significantly. Enough. The infected remained a constant, but no longer dominated decisions. They were part of the environment. Humans remained the greater variable. I designed behavior to avoid both without confronting either. Avoidance scaled better than defense. Defense requires energy and visibility. I chose invisibility and patience. Those qualities compound. Over time, naturally, purpose shifted again quietly. At first it had escaped. Then endurance. Now it was stewardship. Maintaining systems, Preserving options and staying adaptable became the goal. Survival wasn't heroic. It was custodial. I kept things working, not impressive. That reduced unnecessary risk. It also reduced regret. Survival felt quieter, stable. The stadium became the boundary of my world. Not a prison, not a fortress, simply the environment I managed. Thinking smaller kept me alive. I stopped imagining elsewhere. Elsewhere encouraged mistakes. Here demanded attention. Attention preserved control. Control preserved time. Time preserved options. Options preserve life. That chain held. Still, I prepared to leave without planning to. Preparation kept me flexible. Planning too far created attachment. I rehearsed exits mentally, not physically. Physical rehearsal leaves traces. Mental rehearsal costs nothing. If departure became necessary, I could act. Until then, I stayed. Staying was not stagnation. It was patience practiced daily. Conflict had not ended my survival, but it had narrowed margins. I accepted that margins would continue shrinking. Long-term survival meant adapting faster than conditions worsened. There would be no plateau. Stability was temporary by definition. That truth removed complacency. I audited systems constantly. Nothing was permanent. Not safe. Control. The stadium taught me how to live inside uncertainty, not resolve it. Living meant adapting without narrative. There was no arc, only continuity. Each day resembled the last, with slight variation. Those variations mattered. They signaled change early. I adjusted before the disruption. That kept survival boring. Boring was good here. I stopped measuring time in days. I measured it in errors avoided. Every day without injury or discovery was a success. Success accumulated quietly. No one witnessed it. That anonymity preserved it. I accepted obscurity as protection. Recognition would have been dangerous. Remaining unnoticed became the objective. Everything else followed. Naturally, the stadium was no longer a story. It was context. Context does not end. It continues until replaced. I would leave when conditions demanded it. Or I would adapt again. Neither outcome mattered emotionally. Emotion clouds exit timing. I remained neutral. Neutrality preserves judgment. Judgment preserves life. That was enough. I survived not by conquering the stadium, but by existing within it. The structure outlasted intention. My survival depended on aligning with that truth. The world outside continued without me. Inside, I continued deliberately. No resolution arrived. Only ongoing balance. That balance defined living. Inside uncertainty. Inside the stadium. Still,